latest, over 3,000 lives have been claimed so far. The Palestinian Health Authority says a total of 1,949 Palestinians have been killed in the conflict and have reported nearly 8,000 injuries. On the other hand, Israel's Ministry of Health confirms over 1,300 deaths with more than 3,000 injuries. Since the outbreak of the new conflict, the Gaza Strip has been under Israel's airstrikes. Israel is deploying more military forces at the border of the Gaza Strip. Israeli airstrikes bombards Hamas-run Gaza Strip as it enters 8th day. This comes as more than 1 million Palestinians in North Gaza face an Israeli deadline to flee south. Gazans have received a 24-hour notice from the Israel Defense Forces to flee south before an expected ground offensive. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have been estimated to have headed south from northern Gaza following the Israeli order. According to the United Nations, more than 400,000 Palestinians had been internally displaced due to hostilities prior to the directive. Hamas has vowed to fight to the last drop of blood and told residents to stay. Israel deploys army and tanks in the northern border with Lebanon as it continues to trade barbs with Hezbollah group during the war. This comes as a video journalist was killed while working by a missile strike in southern Lebanon. The strike also resulted in injuring 6 other journalists. Human rights bodies have accused Israel of using white phosphorus munitions in its military operations in Gaza and Lebanon. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says that the Pentagon is ready to deploy more military aid to Israel as Israeli forces prepare for a likely invasion of Gaza. Austin said that munitions like air defense capabilities and other equipment were rapidly flowing to Washington's closest West Asian ally. The United States and other Western allies say that they will support Israel as it prosecutes what Israeli leaders say will be a prolonged war. U.S. top diplomat Antony Blinken is on a multi-country West Asia tour in hopes of making efforts to end the Israel-Gaza conflict. This comes as Israel unleashes the most powerful bombing campaign in the 75-year history of its conflict with Gaza. After a solidarity visit to Tel Aviv, Blinken is now on a 6-nation tour of Arab countries and is currently in Saudi Arabia. Blinken, during his tour, praised Qatar for showing urgency in efforts to persuade the militants to free an estimated 150 hostages. The Israeli military says it has seen a significant movement in the south of Palestine. This comes as Israel's Prime Minister promised further retaliation for Hamas's rampage last week. U.S. President Joe Biden says consultations were underway with regional governments on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza as trapped Palestinians endured a power blackout and shortages of food and water amid fierce Israeli bombing. The United Nations and other organizations warned of a disaster if so many people were forced to flee, calling for the siege to be lifted and to let in aid. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls on all parties to allow humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip and to prevent further civilian casualties as fighting in the region reaches increasingly dangerous levels. Guterres said that Gaza is short of humanitarian supplies, drinking water and power due to siege and airstrikes, and over 34 health facilities were attacked. He noted that he has been in constant contact with the leaders across the region. The UN chief also stressed on focusing ways to reduce suffering and prevent further dangerous escalation in the West Bank or elsewhere in the region. He urged the international community to unite around civilian safety and finding a lasting solution to this unending cycle of death and destruction. Amid the war between Israel and the Palestinian militant group Hamas, another batch of stranded Indians were brought back to India on Saturday as part of the country's ongoing repatriation mission, Operation Ajay. At least 235 Indian passengers, including 2 infants, were safely evacuated from the war-struck country on Friday. According to news agency, the chartered jet took off at 11:02 p.m. local time and landed today morning at the national capital's Indira Gandhi International Airport. The passengers were chosen on a first-come, first-served basis after a drive launched by the Indian Embassy for all Indians to register at the mission's database. There are about 18,000 Indian nationals living and working in Israel. China's envoy to the United Nations, Zhang Jun, has called for efforts to reach a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel as soon as possible to prevent further deterioration of a humanitarian disaster. Speaking at an emergency meeting of the UNSC meet, Zhang noted that the new round of conflict is causing large-scale civilian casualties and a humanitarian crisis. Zhang reiterated that China condemns all violence and attacks against civilians and opposes to any action that violates the international humanitarian law. The envoy also expressed support for diplomatic mediation to ensure the safety and humanitarian needs of hostages, as well as their early release and safe return to home. The Iranian foreign minister meets the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad and Syrian foreign minister on Friday. The diplomats' talks focused on the situation in Gaza and the conflict between Hamas and Israel. Mekdad emphasized that everybody should respect international humanitarian law, and during the meet, Amir Abdullahian reiterated that Palestinian leaders are ready for possible scenarios. Russian investigators detain 3 lawyers who have worked for Alexei Navalny in what is being perceived as a move to deepen his isolation and deprive him of legal support. The detentions came as Navalny awaits transfer from the penal colony where he has been held to a harsher special regime establishment. Navalny, the best-known domestic critic of President Vladimir Putin, was sentenced to an additional 19 years in prison on top of 11.5 years. Navalny has been in prison for 2 years and 9 months since being arrested on his return from Germany, where he had been treated after being poisoned with a nerve agent in Siberia. Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives scramble to find a new speaker as Congressman Jim Jordan wins an internal vote. Jordan, endorsed by former President Donald Trump and ex-Speaker Kevin McCarthy, defeated a surprise candidate, Austin Scott of Georgia, who had barely campaigned. According to media reports, Jordan's victory won by 124 votes to 81, meaning that he gained only 25 votes since his defeat by Steve Scalise in a previous contest. Scalise subsequently abandoned his bid after failing to secure enough support for a floor vote. It remains far from certain whether Jordan can avoid a similar fate. New Zealanders went to the polls today in a general election that could see Prime Minister Chris Hipkins continue Labour's reign for another 3 years, or a shift to the Conservatives led by Christopher Luxon. Labour Party leader Hipkins and National Party leader Luxon are facing off to form the country's 54th parliament. Doors to polling booth opened at 9 a.m. and over 1 million votes have already been cast. Restrictions are in place on what news media can report about the race until polls close at 7 p.m. After this, the Electoral Commission is expected to begin releasing preliminary results. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte visit the Black Sea port of Odessa. During the visit, both leaders vowed to improve Ukraine's air defenses and to increase the security of a humanitarian corridor for grain exports. Zelensky said Kyiv was working to strengthen its position in the Black Sea that it can continue grain exports, which are vital to ensuring budget revenues following a surge in defense spending. In August, Ukraine announced a new humanitarian corridor in the Black Sea following Moscow's withdrawal from a deal allowing the safe export of grain from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. Kyiv has sought safe shipping routes as airstrikes inflicted damage on its port and grain export infrastructure near the Black Sea and on the Danube River. The European Union's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, says that EU takes China seriously and expects the same in return on geopolitical issues and trade. Speaking at a news conference in Beijing, Borrell emphasized the importance of cooperation between China and Europe and in the hope of receiving adequate attention from Beijing. Borrell added that he has also discussed the crisis in Israel and Gaza with Chinese officials. Hours before the start of election silence, Poland's main political parties hold their final rallies on Friday, hoping to sway undecided voters ahead of a tight Sunday vote. The opposition says the vote could be the last chance to halt what it sees as Poland's drift away from the European mainstream and towards a semi-authoritarian system. Since coming to power in 2015, the Nationalist Law and Justice Party has repeatedly clashed with the EU over reforms. Critics say it has politicized the judicial system and turned state-owned media into a propaganda outlet. With war raging in neighboring Ukraine and a migrant crisis brewing, national security and immigration have featured heavily in a campaign that was also marked by a souring of relations with Kyiv over Poland's ban on grain imports. A Copa Airlines aircraft was turned back to Panama City following a suspected bomb threat. Authorities said the 144 passengers on board were disembarked, but the scare turned out to be a false alarm. Officials carried out an emergency inspection of the US-bound aircraft and identified a disposable diaper for adults as the object that prompted the scare. The aircraft had been isolated from other planes when it landed back at Panama City's international airport following the bomb scare. Passengers have begun boarding the aircraft to resume their flight that was headed for the US city of Tampa, Copa. Copa Airlines said in a statement later. Australia begins voting in a historic referendum. This is to decide whether to recognize its First Peoples in the Constitution as requested by the country's Indigenous leaders 6 years ago. Australians will simply write yes or no on the ballot paper for a question asking whether they agree to alter the 122-year-old Constitution to recognize Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. Counting of the votes will begin after polls close at 6 p.m. and the Australian Electoral Commission will release updated tallies as they come in from voting centres. US President Joe Biden announces $7 billion in federal grants across 16 states for the development of 7 regional hydrogen hubs. This advance is a key part of a plan to decarbonize the US economy. The 7 proposed hubs involving companies ranging from ExxonMobil to Amazon were selected, with their projects spanning 16 states from Pennsylvania to California. The program is intended to jumpstart the production of clean hydrogen, along with the infrastructure needed to get it to industrial users like steel makers and cement plants. The Biden administration has set a target to increase clean hydrogen output to 10 million metric tons by 2030 and 50 million by 2015, up 5-fold from today. Astronomy aficionados gathered in Colombia's Taracoa Desert to set camps and telescopes with one objective in mind: watching the annular eclipse. Taracoa is considered by experts to be one of the best places in the South American country to see the astronomical event, allowing spectators to see what is known as a ring of fire. Colombian Astronomy Association will carry out different activities in Taracoa, such as conferences and guidance for those who want to photograph the eclipse. India aims to push developed nations towards becoming carbon negative rather than carbon neutral by 2050. Government sources have told Reuters that this would allow emerging market economies more time to use fossil fuels for development needs. India, which is resisting calls to commit to a deadline for phasing out its own use of coal and other fossil fuels, is set to make its proposal at the climate summit in Dubai later this year. Developed countries, including the United States, Britain, Canada and Japan, are targeting net zero by 2050. India has committed to reaching that goal by 2070. Eurozone's industrial production rose by more than expected in August as factories made more consumer goods. Nevertheless, overall output was down by more than 5% from a year earlier. The European Union said industrial production in the Eurozone rose by 0.6% month-on-month in August, for a 5.1% year-on-year decline. The stronger than expected month-on-month numbers resulted from a 1.2% rebound in production of durable consumer goods such as televisions or fridges after a decline in July. Compared with a year earlier, all types of production were 5 to 7% lower, except for non-durable consumer goods, which were down 1.4%.